This episode is based on publicly reported information about a real missing child case. The purpose of this video is educational, and it is designed to help English learners improve their listening skills through a true crime story. Some details in this case are still disputed, and there has been no final conviction. Tonight, we go back to Portugal, to a quiet holiday resort near the sea. It was supposed to be a normal family holiday, with sunny mornings, children playing, parents relaxing, and dinners with friends. Nothing seemed unusual, and nothing seems dangerous. But on one spring night, everything changed. A little girl disappeared from her holiday apartment. Her name was Madeleine McCann. She was only 3 years old, and more than 17 years later, people around the world are still asking the same question. What happened to Madeleine? Madeleine traveled to Portugal with her parents, Kate and Jerry McCann, her younger twin brother and sister, and a group of family friends. They were staying in Praia da Luz, a small holiday town in the Algarve. During the day, the resort looked peaceful, with families walking through the streets, children playing near the pool, and tourists enjoying the warm weather. It was the kind of place where people came to rest, to forget their problems, and to feel safe. But sometimes, the most frightening stories do not begin in dark streets or abandoned houses. Sometimes, they begin in places that look completely ordinary, and that is what makes this case so unsettling. The McCann family was staying at the Ocean Club Resort. Their apartment was on the ground floor, close to the restaurant where the adults had dinner that evening. On the evening of May 3rd, 2007, Madeleine and her younger siblings were in the apartment. The children were supposed to be asleep, while the adults were having dinner nearby with their friends at the resort's tapas restaurant. According to the adults, they checked on the children during the evening, and at first, everything seemed normal. The night was calm, the resort was quiet, and the children were sleeping. But later that evening, Kate McCann returned to the apartment. She walked inside and looked toward the children's room. And then she saw something that no parent should ever see. Madeleine's bed was empty. For a few seconds, there was confusion. Maybe Madeleine had gone to another room. Maybe she was hiding. Or maybe there was a simple explanation. But very quickly, that hope disappeared. Madeleine was not in the bedroom. She was not in the apartment. And she was not with her brother and sister. She was gone. A normal holiday night had become the beginning of one of the most famous missing person cases in modern history. The search began immediately, with friends looking around the resort, staff being alerted, and the police being contacted. People called her name again and again. Madeleine! Madeleine! But there was no answer. There were no footsteps, no voice, and no small child running back. Only silence. And from that silence, a mystery began. A mystery that would cross countries, fill newspapers, divide public opinion, and remain unsolved for years. Because after that night, the world would hear one question again and again. Where is Madeleine McCann? And the most painful part is this. No one could give a final answer. The first hours after Madeleine was discovered missing, the peaceful holiday resort changed completely. Only a few minutes earlier, it had been a quiet evening with people eating, families talking, and the streets around the resort calm. But now, everything felt different. There was panic, there was confusion, and there was one terrible question in everyone's mind. Where was Madeleine? Kate McCann returned to the tapas restaurant and raised the alarm. The adults stopped eating. The evening was no longer normal. It was no longer a family dinner. It was the beginning of a search. At first, people hoped Madeleine was nearby. Maybe she had woken up. Maybe she had walked out of the apartment. Maybe she was lost somewhere inside the resort. That was the first hope. A simple explanation, a child who had wandered away. So they started looking. They searched around the apartment, the nearby paths, and the area close to the restaurant. They called her name again and again. Madeleine! Madeleine! But there was no answer. No little voice. No crying. No sound of a child hiding nearby. The longer the search continued, the more frightening the situation became. Because if Madeleine was not inside the apartment and she was not close to the restaurant, then where was she? More people joined the search. Friends, resort workers, and other guests started looking around Praia da Luz. Soon, the quiet streets were full of worried voices. People checked behind buildings, dark corners, small paths, and nearby streets. Every minute mattered, and every second felt important. For Madeleine's parents, those first moments must have been impossible to understand. One moment, their daughter was supposed to be sleeping. The next moment, she was gone. No parent is prepared for that kind of fear. No parent expects a normal holiday evening to become a nightmare. The police were contacted, and the search became more serious. But the first hours of any missing child case are extremely important. People try to remember what they saw. They try to remember small details. A person walking alone, a strange movement, a door, a window, a sound, anything that might help. But the problem with fear is that it changes everything. People become emotional. Memories become confused. The night becomes a collection of fragments. Small pieces, small moments, small details that may be important or may mean nothing at all. Some people later spoke about what they thought they had seen that night. Different witnesses gave different memories. Some details were clear, while others were uncertain. And this would become one of the most difficult parts of the case. Not only what happened, but what people believed they saw. As the night continued, the search expanded beyond the resort. People looked through nearby streets, areas close to the beach, and places where a small child might go. But Praia da Luz was not just one building. It was a town with streets, cars, apartments, restaurants, dark places, open spaces, and the sea not far away. The darkness made everything harder. At night, ordinary places can look unfamiliar. A quiet street can feel threatening. A shadow can look like a person. A sound can make people turn around. And every empty space creates another question. Was Madeleine here? Did someone pass this way? Was there something everyone missed? Hours passed, and still there was no sign of Madeleine. No confirmed sighting, no simple explanation. No moment where someone could say, "There she is." By the next day, the case was already becoming much bigger. Madeleine was not just a missing child from one apartment. She was becoming the center of an international story. Portuguese police were involved. British attention was growing. Journalists began arriving. Cameras appeared. And soon, the whole world would know her name. But before the headlines, before the interviews, and before the theories, there was only one thing. A family looking for their little girl. A resort full of fear. and a night with no answer. In the days that followed, investigators would begin to examine the apartment, speak to witnesses, and build a timeline of the evening. They would ask difficult questions. Who was nearby? Who saw what? When was Madeleine last seen? Could she have left by herself? Or did someone take her? These questions would shape the entire investigation. And as the case grew, one thing became painfully clear. The first night had not given the answers everyone needed. It had only created more questions. And the biggest question remained the same. Where was Madeleine McCann? The investigation begins. The next morning, Praia da Luz did not feel like the same place anymore. The sun rose over the town, but the calm feeling of the holiday resort was gone. People were no longer walking around only as tourists. They were looking, asking questions, and trying to understand how a little girl could disappear during a family holiday. Madeleine's face began to appear everywhere. People spoke about her in restaurants, in streets, and around the resort. Some people wanted to help. Others simply could not believe that something like this had happened in such a quiet place. Investigators began to focus on the apartment, the timeline, and the people who had been nearby that evening. They needed to understand the last confirmed moments before Madeleine disappeared. Who saw her? At what time? Who checked the apartment? What was open? What was closed? What did people remember hearing or seeing? These questions sound simple, but in a real investigation, they are not simple at all. A missing child case is full of pressure. Every detail can feel important. Every minute can matter. And every memory can change the direction of the search. The apartment became one of the most important places in the case. It was not just a holiday apartment anymore. It was the last place where Madeleine had been seen. Investigators had to look at the rooms, the windows, the doors, and the area around the building. They had to ask whether Madeleine could have left by herself or whether someone else had entered. At the same time, the timeline of the evening became extremely important. The adults said they had been checking on the children during dinner. Investigators needed to understand those checks, the times, and the movements of each person. In cases like this, a few minutes can become very important, because a few minutes may be enough for something terrible to happen. But the more people tried to build the timeline, the more difficult everything became. Different people remembered different things. Some memories were precise, while others were less clear. This does not always mean that someone is lying. Fear, shock, and confusion can affect the way people remember a night. Still, for investigators, every detail mattered. Witness statements also became a major part of the investigation. People were asked whether they had seen anyone unusual near the resort. Some witnesses spoke about possible movements, possible strangers, or moments that felt suspicious after Madeleine disappeared. But a witness statement is not the same as proof. Sometimes, people see something important. Sometimes, they see something ordinary, and only later believe it may be connected. That is one of the hardest parts of true crime cases. Investigators have to listen to everything, but they also have to separate facts from fear, memory, and speculation. In the first days, the search continued. People looked through streets, nearby areas, and places around Praia da Luz. The hope was still there. Maybe Madeleine would be found nearby. Maybe someone had seen her. Maybe there was still a chance to bring her home quickly. But as the hours became days, the case started to change. It was no longer only a local investigation. British newspapers began to report the story. Television cameras arrived. Journalists came to Praia da Luz. Soon, Madeleine's disappearance was not only known in Portugal and the United Kingdom, it was known around the world. And this created another problem. The attention helped spread Madeleine's image. More people knew her face. More people could report possible sightings. More people could help. But media attention can also make a case more complicated. Rumors spread quickly. Theories appear before all the facts are known. People begin to judge from a distance. A real child, a real family, and a real investigation can become part of a public debate. For the McCann family, the situation became almost impossible. They were parents searching for their daughter, but they were also suddenly in front of cameras, newspapers, and millions of strangers. Every word, every expression, and every decision was watched. Some people felt sympathy. Others started asking difficult questions. And as the case became more famous, public opinion became divided. But behind all of that noise, one painful fact remained the same. Madeleine was still missing. The investigation continued. Police followed leads. People reported possible sightings. Different countries became part of the search. But none of those early days brought the answer everyone wanted. There was no clear ending, no confirmed place, no final explanation, only a growing mystery. A mystery built from a quiet resort, a missing child, a difficult timeline, and a world that could not stop looking. And as the investigation moved forward, another question began to appear. Not only where was Madeleine, but who, if anyone, knew more than they were saying. The case that never disappeared. As the days became weeks, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann moved far beyond Praia da Luz. What began as a search in a small holiday town became a story followed by millions of people around the world. Her face appeared on television, in newspapers, on posters, and across the internet. People who had never been to Portugal suddenly knew the name Madeleine McCann. The attention was enormous. In some ways, it helped. More people knew her face, and more people could report possible information. But it also made the investigation much more complicated. Because when a case becomes famous, everyone has an opinion. Some people focused on the timeline. Others focused on the apartment. Some people believed Madeleine had been taken by a stranger, while others questioned how something like this could happen so quickly. There were theories, rumors, arguments, and endless discussions. But a theory is not the same as proof. And in a real case, proof is what matters. For investigators, the challenge was not only to listen to information, but to decide what was useful and what was only noise. A possible sighting could be important, or it could be a mistake. A strange detail could be meaningful, or it could be nothing. The case was full of small pieces, but the full picture was still missing. Years passed, but the case did not disappear. Madeleine's parents continued searching. Appeals were made. Questions were repeated. People came forward with possible information. Police forces in different countries looked at different parts of the case. The story remained in the public eye, not because it had been solved, but because it had not. And that is one of the reasons this case stayed in people's minds for so long. There was no clear ending, no simple answer, no moment when the world could say, "Now we finally understand what happened." There was only uncertainty. In 2011, the Metropolitan Police in London began Operation Grange, a major review and investigation into Madeleine's disappearance. This meant that, years after the night in Praia da Luz, the case was still being examined. Investigators looked again at evidence, timelines, witnesses, and possible leads. For many people, this gave new hope. Maybe something had been missed. Maybe a detail that seemed small before could become important later. Sometimes, old cases are solved because someone looks at the evidence in a new way. Sometimes, a case changes because technology improves. And sometimes, a person who stayed silent for years finally speaks. But hope can be painful when answers do not come. Over the years, several possible leads were investigated. Some disappeared. Some were not strong enough. Some created headlines, but not final answers. And then, years later, a German man named Christian Bruckner became a major suspect in the investigation. Authorities connected him to the Algarve area around the time Madeleine disappeared. His name brought new attention to the case, and for many people, it felt like a possible turning point. But it is important to be very clear. He has not been convicted in Madeleine's case, and the investigation has not produced a final answer. In true crime, this distinction matters. Suspicion is not conviction. A lead is not proof. And a question is not an answer. This is why the Madeleine McCann case is so difficult to tell. There are facts, but there are also many things that remain unknown. We know where the family was staying. We know the date. We know the evening became a nightmare. We know that searches, interviews, and investigations followed for years. But the most important part is still missing. What happened to Madeleine after she disappeared from the apartment? That question has followed the case from the first night until today. For the public, the case became a mystery. For journalists, it became a global story. For investigators, it became a long and difficult search for evidence. But for Madeleine's family, it was never just a famous case. It was their daughter, their little girl, a child who should have been safe, sleeping during a family holiday. That human truth can sometimes get lost when people speak about theories. Behind every headline, there is a real person. Behind every debate, there is a family. And behind every unsolved case, there is a silence that never truly goes away. The world kept asking questions. Was Madeleine taken by someone nearby? Was there a missed clue in the first hours? Did someone see something and never understand its importance? Could one small detail still change everything? These questions are uncomfortable because they do not have easy answers. They stay open. They stay unresolved. They make the case feel close, even after so many years. And maybe that is why people still remember Madeleine's name. Not only because she disappeared, but because the mystery never ended. A quiet resort, a family dinner, an empty bed, a search in the darkness, and then years of questions. No final answer, no complete explanation, only the same painful mystery. Where is Madeleine McCann? The unanswered questions. There are cases that become famous because of what is known. But there are other cases that become famous because of what is missing. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann belongs to that second group. It is not only a story about one night in Portugal. It is a story about gaps, doubts, memories, and questions that never completely disappeared. From the beginning, people wanted a simple answer. They wanted to know where Madeleine was, who had taken her, or how she could have vanished from a holiday apartment. But the case did not give a simple answer. Instead, it gave investigators a difficult timeline, emotional witnesses, international pressure, and years of uncertainty. One of the hardest questions was about opportunity. If someone entered the apartment, how did they do it? How much time did they have? Did they know the area? Did they watch the family before that night? Or was it a sudden crime, something that happened quickly and unexpectedly? These questions mattered because they changed the way people understood the case. A planned crime would suggest one kind of person. A sudden opportunity would suggest another. But without a clear answer, the mystery stayed open. Another difficult question was about the apartment itself. What was open? What was closed? What could be seen from outside? What could someone hear? In a normal holiday, these details might not matter. But after Madeleine disappeared, every small detail became important. Then there were the witness memories. In many true crime cases, witnesses are extremely important, but they can also make an investigation more complicated. A person may remember a face, a movement, or a moment in the street. But memory is not perfect, especially after fear, shock, and media attention. Someone may believe they saw something unusual. Another person may remember the same moment differently. A detail that feels important at midnight may look different the next day. And when the world is watching, even small memories can become headlines. This is why investigators have to be careful. They cannot follow every rumor as if it were proof, but they also cannot ignore a detail that might lead somewhere. As years passed, the case became part of public memory. People who were children when Madeleine disappeared became adults. New investigators looked at old information. New reports appeared. Old questions returned. And every time the case came back into the news, people felt the same thing again. Maybe now there will be an answer. But hope can be fragile. Sometimes a new search brings attention, but no final result. Sometimes a suspect is named, but no conviction follows. Sometimes a possible lead looks important and then disappears into uncertainty. For the public, this can feel frustrating. For a family, it must be almost unbearable. What makes this case so haunting is not only that Madeleine vanished, it is that the story has never truly ended. There was no final scene, no confirmed explanation, no moment when the world could stop asking questions. And because of that, people continue to return to the same night, the same resort, the same apartment, the same empty bed. But when we speak about this case, it is important to remember something. Madeleine McCann is not just the name of a mystery. She was a little girl. She had a family, a life, a face, a voice, and a future that should have continued. True crime can be fascinating, but it can also become cold if we forget the human side. Behind every theory, there is a real child. Behind every headline, there are real people. And behind every unanswered question, there is pain. That is why this story should be told with care. Maybe one day, a witness will remember something important. Maybe one day, evidence will be understood in a new way. Maybe one day, someone will speak. Or maybe the truth is already hidden somewhere in the details of that first night, waiting for someone to connect the pieces. Until then, the case remains one of the most painful mysteries of modern true crime. A family holiday, A quiet town, a dinner nearby, a child asleep, and then an empty bed. More than 17 years later, the question is still there. Not because people enjoy the mystery, but because a child disappeared, and the world still does not know why. Where is Madeleine McCann? And what really happened that night in Praia da Luz?
You are listening to The Story Room English. Real stories. Simple English. If you want to keep improving your English with true stories, mysteries, famous lives, and pop culture moments, subscribe and come back for the next episode. Until then, keep listening, keep learning, and stay curious.